This one, I'm going to be going through each category and whether or not I actually use the stuff in that type of plugin. So the first one on here is EQ. If you're not familiar with EQ, I'll pull up, this is kind of one of the really popular ones, Pro Q3. And what that does is, so there's this line here, and it's basically on the left you have low frequencies, and on the right you have high frequencies. And the idea is that you can boost or attenuate, just kind of cut different frequency ranges. So I'm just going to play some of this, and you can hear I can really boost the lows, and I can bring it, and it can be whatever frequencies you want. This obviously sounds really bad. I don't even have my headphones on. This is definitely something that gets used a lot in mastering. EQ is kind of like one of the bread and butter. It's a lot of what it is just adjusting the overall frequency balancing using EQ. The next section, you have dynamics, and dynamics can go through a lot of different things. So you have compressors is kind of a very just broad category, but it's just anything that takes, for example, there's this moment here that's pretty loud and then suddenly gets soft, and I can have it so it turns down the loud part and keeps the soft part. So I'm just guessing, but yeah, so you can see that big red thing. That was it turning down the volume on the loud part and turning up the quiet parts. That's really useful for, like, an example in radio, those sorts of things, to get like an even level of speech so you can easily hear it, and other things that makes it just easier to hear what's going on. With classical music, the dynamics are really important. So it's very rare that I actually use any sort of compression going on. I will use a subset of compression called limiting. So I'm going to pull up another FabFilter plugin. This one is a limiter. So what this does is I can take some like loud moments, and it shows, you can see the parts. And so I'm seeing like, okay, it's coming in somewhere between 9 and 12. And so I can bring up the volume. Let's try like 11-ish. And now you see these little red bits where it says minus 1.5. And so it's turning down the volume just that little bit. And the difference between compression and limiting is that compression you can control by how much, like for every 10 decibels it goes above like a certain point, then you'll want that to become 1 decibel, or it could be 2. For every 2 decibels it goes above, that becomes 1. Limiting is much more aggressive, where basically anything above that point stays the same volume. It's very consistent past that point. I do use this very slightly. So the way I was showing here, where I would actually probably like put it at exactly 11, and it's just barely touching the loudest points, is how I typically use this when mastering classical. I just use it to bring up the overall level and just maybe bring off the slightest bits, just to be able to kind of get it slightly more consistent. The amount that I'm actually shaving off is just tiny little peaks. In general, you don't really need to. Alternatively to a limiter, you could use the effects that are built into your DAW. So for example, in Pro Tools, there's one called Normalize. If you look just about any DAW, even Audacity has something called Normalize, and you can set it. I'm going to set it so it peaks at, let's say, -1. That's a nice kind of safe spot, and I could do that for the entire file. So that's another alternative instead of using a limiter. I just like the limiter because I get a little bit of control and I can kind of push it a little bit more if need to, but I am very, very gentle with it. I rarely go more than 2 decibels of limiting. And that about covers everything in dynamics. There are other types of things such as the gates and whatnot, but I'm really not using those. Pitch shifters, not using this. There's no reason to pitch something up an octave. You might think like, oh, do you ever tune stuff? I don't tune things in a mastering stage, especially since when there's multiple chords, it's just not going to go well. I've yet to find a reason to use a pitch shifter for mastering classical music. It's just not needed. Reverb. Reverb is the next one on here. I don't default to using reverb, but sometimes I will, especially if it's a recording someone did of themselves and they just want it to sound better and it wasn't in the very big room. Sometimes I'll just make it sound a little bit bigger. I'm not putting in large tails. I'm just going to take like a small classroom and make it sound a little bit bigger, just a little bit more fullness to the sound, especially when it's stuffy. Sometimes a hall is very dry, especially if it's in more of a theater and not necessarily an auditorium or a recital hall. And then I will just add a little bit more like reverberance and tail. But I typically am not going to do that for any sort of audition tape or anything like that. I'm going to be doing that when it's for like a performance or something like that, where someone just really wants to sound good, not necessarily they're trying to audition or win some sort of competition. Next up is delay. You could potentially use delay as a reverb. I haven't done so just because a reverb is going to be much more true to an actual hall. Harmonics. Some mastering engineers and some classical types do use harmonics, different like distortions, very subtly to warm up the sound. This is not an area that I've just never really liked it. There's moments where I do kind of like it, but then suddenly if I listen a little bit more carefully, I just end up hearing something I don't. And so I've never been fully satisfied with something that I really feel I can just put this on the entire recording and it just makes it sound better. I haven't had that experience. There's been others that I know who have, and they show it to musicians and they really like the sound. I haven't had that experience. Noise reduction. This is something I try to avoid using, but generally sometimes have to. There's a whole suite of tools. If you can see, the company is Isotope. They have a whole suite of tools: declicking, declipping, crackling, humming, noising, de-reverb, these sorts of things. They tend to create a lot of extra sounds that aren't there because you're trying to remove something. Artifacts is a name for it. I, as much as possible, try to avoid using these tools. I really only use it when I feel it's necessary, and then when I feel that any artifacts that are created are subtle enough to not be noticed unless you're listening for them. And so in a lot of times it really is a balance between getting improvements of reducing the noise and getting the artifacts. That's a whole video in and of itself, but I generally try to avoid using those if at all possible. Dither, this is like a weird technical thing. I'm not sure why Pro Tools even has this as its own category. Most likely your DAW is actually dithering for you anyway, and you only need that in certain scenarios. So honestly, you don't really worry about it. Sound field is what Pro Tools calls different stereo things, and I do use a lot. A big part of what I'm doing is balancing out the left and right the speakers, making sure that the sound really feels like the ensemble feels balanced from left and right, that is not feeling like it's just tilted all to one side. You don't want things to feel off balance. So a lot of that's what we're trying to achieve is balance between the frequencies, balance between the left and right. So the sound fields category here, definitely something that I'm in here a lot. And even you can see this one's highlighted there. And that's one I use a lot. Instrument, these are just virtual instruments. I'm not reinforcing things and mastering. And then effects, these are all sorts of weird things. I also skipped modulation, which can be tied into with effects. These are strange things like phasers, just all sorts of effects, and we just make strange sounds. I'm not using these in mastering. It might be fun to throw on some effects and kind of laugh, but it's good for creating cool effects if you're Led Zeppelin or something like that. But for mastering classical music, we really don't need these. And then the other category is just anything that doesn't fit into the above. I'm looking through these. I mean, some of these, like this is an EQ plugin that should be there. And so these generally I'm not going to be using in classical music. The only one that it could potentially be useful is this one, correlometer, which is basically shows how much of the information is the same between the left and right. That's all you would really need to know is if you're trying to correct a problem, but that's also, again, more advanced. So those are the various tools that you could potentially encounter and try to use when mastering, and which ones I do use and don't use. Hopefully this is helpful. Let me know down in the comments, questions or anything like that. I'm more than happy to help. I'll try to pop in frequently and give any answers.